Hey, it's Drybear. And as I've been working through my deep dive of Necromancer, trying to make all of the mechanics in the kit viable and see how many builds I can actually make for Necro that can clear the endgame content, when I saw viewers that have been asking about a Thorns Necromancer build. Can you update your Thorns build from beta? Can you see how far it can go? And what would you change about it to make it viable for everything that we know about the game now? And so ask and ye shall receive. For the last few days, I have been workshopping Thorns as a mechanic for Necromancer and how to best bring it to life. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me in the community, the next time you're getting water or something out of your fridge, it's going to start making a bit of a suspect sound that makes you think there's something wrong with it. There's nothing actually wrong with it. It just sounds that way. All right, so this is the updated version of my spiked Ribcage Necromancer that focuses primarily on Thorns damage. So there are some caveats here and some downsides to Thorns in general, and we'll walk through those so you understand what's going on. But I was able to push this up to about Nightmare 68 to 70. My stats aren't perfect. The gear could be optimized much more. You could probably push full Thorns to maybe 75 or 80 if you really optimized it, which is encouraging. I think one of the major downsides to Thorns is that it is very mob type dependent, which you can expect from understanding what Thorns does, right? Thorns just says, if an enemy attacks me, I deal damage to it. And so there are some mobs in the game that don't attack very often, like the Maguses you see on screen right now, or the Fallen Shamans. They just don't attack very often, and because of that, you don't do a lot of damage to them, which ends up nerfing you pretty hard and takes you a while to take them down. It is added benefit if you have other enemies nearby, because there is a legendary Needle Flare that when you proc Thorns, you have a chance to proc it in AoE. So I will often try to drag mobs to the next pack so that I can stack them all together and use the other mobs to proc Needle Flare on the bigger mobs. And the other challenge is that your biggest enemy with pure Thorns is going to be inanimate objects. Gates, blockades, skeletal constructs, corpse piles, rocks, any mob that doesn't attack. So if it's a sequence of events and the mob is channeling something to summon a big demon, but they never attack ever, your damage gets gimped pretty hard. And so you have those downsides there. And we'll walk through the process of how I landed on this Thorns build specifically, but it does clear end game content and is quite effective. And it's hilarious too, because some mobs that attack with heavy attacks, they have higher coefficients for Thorns. I've had big, heavy elites one-shot themselves because they whacked me and my minions. And it's very funny and hilarious, actually, to watch mobs just break themselves on you as you walk by. And because it doesn't require all of the damage scaling stats that you would get with other builds, you're free to run a lot of damage reduction. So this is probably one of the tankiest builds in the game. So if you're interested in just being the immovable object with spikes all over you, then this build is definitely for you. Now, when we kicked off this journey to figure out Thorns, did a bunch of testing to figure out exactly what mechanics we needed to make this the best mechanic that it could. So all of my findings are on screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are the things that affect Thorns the most. Keep in mind that the Thorns proc from you does proc defensive bonuses like Disobedience. Needle Flare does not proc from your minions. It can only proc from your Thorns specifically. But anything that scales minion damage will scale the damage of the Thorns that they proc. And Blighted Aspect turned out to be one of the best scalers because it gives you a 120% damage bonus. And that damage bonus affects Thorns, which is huge. It affects your minion Thorns too. It is the best way. And so I was able to scale the Thorns damage quite significantly utilizing Blighted Aspect and then using minions. The other question I had is, would this build be better or worse with minions? And it turns out that after a lot of testing, it is actually stronger to use minions with Thorns than it is to just invest in Thorns for yourself. I also have down in the description a link to my one sheet, which is a format I've been building for my builds for Diablo 4, which lists all of the best in slot stats, where to put the legendary powers, where to put the uniques, and then also the gems, the best elixirs for this build, the best incenses, what affixes to avoid, and then as well as a skill priority rotation, alternative aspects that do work for the build, and some notes on how to play it. So this is along with a full build calculator on d4builds.gg is linked down in the description and in the comments. You can use this to look through the full Paragon build, all of the skill build, and everything about the build if you're looking to run this one. Blood Golem, or the Bone Golem, is the best here with the extra inherited thorns, and because he has a taunt ability, he'll make everyone attack him, which helps you reposition and get mobs together, but also means that they can focus on your Golem, and your Golem, with the Bone Golem second modification, gets 50% of your Thorns value, which means that he can get really strong, and you can also roll Golem Thorns on your gear as well, which gives you some good value. So we have that going for us. The next thing we want from this is we want an ultimate, and the first thing that I had tried was using Army of the Dead with the Unyielding Commander aspect. This allows you to get 90% damage reduction on your minions. It gives them attack speed, but attack speed doesn't matter in this build. We just care about the mobs hitting us rather than us hitting them. So we want to be able to let the mobs hit us. And it turned out that Bone Storm was a better effect for this with the Shielding Storm, which gives us shielding, and that barrier does get applied to our minions as well. So we still were able to get plenty of damage and survivability out of that, and then the Thorns procs are nice. And you can see that depending on what mob type you're facing, some mob types actually get utterly destroyed by Thorns. If it's a mob type that attacks aggressively and attacks quickly, then you can absolutely destroy them, not only from the Thorns from you and your minions, but also from the Needle Flare procs. When you gather everyone together and you proc that Needle Flare, you can do insane amounts of damage. And then sometimes you face mob types that are kind of passive. They don't attack very often. They float around like Succubus or Fallen Shaman or inanimate objects, and then your damage goes down dramatically. So there are downsides with this build, but it can clear pretty respectable content, and it's pretty funny to just walk around and let them hit you. On top of that, I went for the bonuses for Blighted aspect. This was the best way that I found to scale the Thorns damage. What this says is that when you deal shadow damage to a target that is affected by Shadow Blight, you gain stacks, and when you get to 10 stacks, Blighted aspects procs. You can see it in the bottom middle right now. I have it Blighted activated, and then I start working my way back up. So to properly proc Blighted, we need to have a lot of shadow damage, and we accomplish that with 3 abilities. One, with Reap. We like Reap because it does shadow damage primarily. It spawns corpses for us so we can keep our minions alive and get some damage reduction when we're standing near corpses from our Paragon board. But it also gives us 15% damage reduction, so we want to maintain that Reap bonus at all times. Then we run Blight, which is another modifier. It does a big puddle in front of you that does shadow damage, which helps you proc your Blighted. It also has the benefit of running Void Legendary, which means that that's how we gather mobs up. It's actually better than Corpse Tendril if you can work Blight into your build, because it has constant suck on the enemies, and it actually doesn't have diminishing returns either. So you can gather up enemies pretty easily to deal with that. That's more damage, and on top of that, we run the modifier to increase your damage and minion damage to targets affected by Blight, which does affect your Thorns. And lastly, we run with the Bone Storm with the, you can see the Fallen just dying to this because they attack so frequently. The Bone Storm with the modifier Ultimate Shadow to make it so that it does shadow damage. That's 3 shadow damage abilities. We keep Blighted up almost all of the time, which increases our Thorns damage quite significantly. And then with Ossuous Gale and, of course, the Shielding Storm, we get Barrier constantly from Bone Storm. Decrepify lowers the cooldown and applies damage reduction. And so our goal is just to walk into a room, Decrepify all enemies, use Blight to suck everything in. You can taunt with the Golem, and then you just start spamming Blight and Reap over and over and over while Bone Storm is active. You get your Blight effect, and then Needle Flare is throwing off and blowing up and doing Thorns damage. And then as the enemies attack, they kill themselves on you, and it's actually really hilarious. Some mobs have higher coefficients for this. Some mobs end up doing way more damage to them than some of the others. But yeah, that's just kind of how the build goes. So for the people that were asking for this build, here it is. Let's start first with the skill build and talk about what's important here. You actually have a lot of free points to play with in this build, because really all we need from this is the abilities that we use, as well as the points that work for our minions to keep them alive and increase their damage. And then around that, you can play whatever you want. So again, we run Reap primarily for the damage reduction, the 15% that we get when we Reap for 2 seconds. We also get a little bit of attack speed, which doesn't matter too much, and then spawning a corpse, which is really nice. This means that we can constantly be healing and replenishing our minions as they die and take damage. And it also means that we can get the bonus from our Paragon board, which gives us 15% damage reduction when we're standing near at least 2 corpses, which we wanted to be doing all the time. We come down here and we do want to get extra damage for Blight. It is kind of a nice tick damage, and it helps you kill the the obelisks and the blood blisters and the gates and the barricades of the world that don't fight back. And it gives you a little extra bit there, and it is kind of nice just for scaling. We max out Blight, and then we pick up the modifier so that we can get increased damage to targets inside of Blight for you and your minions, which does scale the Thorns damage. We have some lucky hit in this build, not a lot, but some, and the extra corpses is nice, so we will pick up Hued Flesh for that as well. We come down here and we pick up Thorns. This gives us 1,400 Thorns, and then we get damage and life for our warriors, which scales their Thorns and keeps them alive. We come down here, we want damage reduction from close and damage to close, which helps with Thorns. Amplify damage, because we're going to be running with the Decrepify, and more specifically, the Abhorrent Decrepify, which is lucky hit to reduce your cooldowns. And this is how we keep Bone Storm up indefinitely. We keep it up all the time. That gives us barriers for us and barriers for our minions, which is really nice. And then Skeletal Mage Mastery as well. We come down here, and you can actually play with some of these defensive options. I actually found running Necrotic Carapace to be quite effective. You don't have a whole lot in this that will proc it other than Reap, but because you have so much damage reduction and you have so much barrier generation, usually you can get to up to full Fortify before Bone Storm goes down, and then that gives you that extra little bonus there. You could pull these points out and put them into things like Gloom or Terror if you wanted to get a little bit more darkness damage. I think those points are kind of flexible on how you spend those. Coming down here, we need to pick up all of the minion effects here. Anytime a minion makes it into your build past Nightmare 50, there's an obligatory amount of points that you need to spend in Skill Tree, Paragon, and Gear to keep them alive. So we get Golem damage and life. This does affect Thorn, so it scales the Thorn value up. We do get attack speed for Healthy, which does help minions kind of keep themselves moving, and it gives us bonuses to the mages. Again, if you wanted, you could pull these points out because attack speed doesn't scale as well, but there isn't like a crazy amount of things that you can put it into. I even tried running Rapid Ossification, but I found that because we're so tanky and we have Decrepify, we don't need the extra cooldown on that specifically. And then you obviously want your Bonded in Essence, which makes your Skeletal Priest heal your minions, which is really good. And then Death's Defense makes it so minions cannot lose more than 30% of their max life in a single hit, which means they can't be 1 or 2 shot, which helps a lot with some of the mobs that they face. And then we pick up the Bone Storm here. You only really want the damage reduction. The crit is kind of nice because it does scale your passive damage. Thorns itself can't crit, but it does give you a little bit more damage against the inanimate objects, your biggest enemy in this build. So you could pull this point out if you wanted, and again, go into something like Gloom or Terror if you really wanted, or kind of come down and maybe get a little bit more essence from harvesting, but I found that it wasn't as necessary. You can even pick up Gruesome Mending for the tricky situations when you get low. Then we're going to come down here, we're going to pick up Shadow Blight because we have Shadow, and we also want to proc the Blighted Legendary. You get Shadow damage, which applies a dot, a short dot, and then you also get bonus damage to the target, and your minions get bonus damage, which does affect Thorns, and then you get a bonus damage from Shadow Blight as well. So we want to have this. This procs our legendary effect for the Blighted aspect, which is super important. So for the gear specifically, we are going to run with what's listed on the sheet, by the way, so you can just use the sheet for reference here. These stats are not perfect, but they're definitely, this is the build that I have now. The 2 uniques we're going to run with are Razor Plate, which can give you up to almost 13,000 Thorns, or maybe even higher, like 13.5, depending on how good the roll is on it. The downside is that it has no other stats, and so you lose out on a legendary defensive aspect on your chest, and you lose out on having other stats, but you get a significant amount of Thorns. We're also going to run with Mendeln. This has Thorns on it and Lucky Hit Chance, which we like. The minion attack speed does nothing for us, but maximum minion life does, so that is useful. And then on top of that, we also get the Lucky Hit proc for physical damage, which is actually pretty decent and gives us a big bonus of damage. This helps us kill single target as well every time this Lucky Hit does proc. Then we want to get Hardened Bones for damage reduction on minions, Needle Flare for AoE Thorns, Disobedience for stacking up massive amounts of armor, Void allows Blight to suck everybody in and keeps us in good position, Blighted Aspect on your main hand, and for this I do recommend a Dagger. The close damage on Dagger does scale Thorns, which is awesome, and we get some offensive stats on that as well. And then for your shield, and you want to run a shield because it has Thorns on it, is going to be Shielding Storm. For your non-unique ring, run Ultimate Shadow with physical damage, which scales Thorns, Lucky Hit, Barrier Generation, and damage to close. And alternatively, you could run Thorns scaling for either warriors or your golem to get extra bonuses there. And then for your neck piece, I found it best to run Ossuous Gale just to get some extra value. You could run Shielding Storm on the amulet. The problem with doing this, though, is Shielding Storm is a defensive, Ossuous Gale is an offensive, which means that you would need to run a focus or you need to swap out one of your offensive legendaries. So I found it best to run Ossuous as an offensive on your amulet and then Shielding Storm in a defensive slot so you don't lose an offensive slot for your legendary aspect. For stats, we love getting damage reduction in every possible form. Damage reduction to close enemies, damage reduction from enemies that are affected by shadow damage over time, damage reduction while you're injured. All of these are super nice. The less damage you take, the longer you can stay in the fight, the longer that you can deal out Thorns damage to the target. And you get to a point where you're just the immovable object. As long as you have Bone Storm up and you're standing and everything's debuffed, you can kind of face off against most things in the game, save for a few mechanics that just one-shot anybody, no matter how tanky that you are. For gems, we like Topaz for damage reduction while crowd controlled. It actually is kind of a boon when you get CC'd because you get significant amounts. You get 60% damage reduction while crowd controlled. Because we're using a shield in our offhand, any gem that goes in that socket is counted as a defensive armor gem. And so we get an extra damage reduction while crowd controlled on there as well. If you run with more fortified, you can run fortified. It's just going to be less damage reduction than damage reduction while crowd controlled. And I found the Topaz to be the best. For weapon, the only option that I think is really viable is ultimate damage from Diamond, because we're not really doing damage from any other ability other than Thorns, and there's no gem on weapon that scales that. And so ultimate damage just makes your Bone Storm do more damage. And then for your accessories, you can run armor for damage reduction. The best elixir for this in the game is going to be Lucky Hit to increase your Mendeln procs, which gives you a nice damage boost. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the Lucky Hit elixir, the Combatant's Fortune, is not craftable. You have to find it from Helltide chests, but it is an insanely good elixir to pick up and use. Aside from that, you can run armor and Thorns, max life, or any other defensive options that you can use for your build. For incense, I would just run Thorns. It's an extra 250 Thorns, which is free. Bad sigils, I would say that there's not only bad sigils for this build, there's also bad dungeons. Some dungeons are full of mobs that are very passive and they walk around and look at you. And I would argue that some of those dungeons are just worth avoiding for a Thorns build because it's too dang slow to kill. Some dungeons are packed full of mobs that attack you aggressively and fast, and those mobs just ruin themselves. So you can do those dungeons quite quickly because of the mob set that's in there. I would also avoid, because this build is a chip damage, war of attrition type build, you kind of chip everyone down slowly. I would recommend avoiding any kind of self-sustain that monsters get. Monster lifesteal or vampiric or any of those that keep them super healthy. Physical resist is bad. Melee resist is bad. Resource burn is pretty rough. Any of those where it lowers your damage anymore, and then also the ones where the minions or the bosses that you face can heal themselves. It just kind of prolongs the fight quite unnecessarily. And then for notes, I have skill rotation, keep Decrepify on all enemies, never engage dangerous enemies unless you have Bone Storm active, use Golem Taunt to enter into rooms where you're not sure what's in there, especially if there's corpse bows, keep the Ray Skeleton buff active, that minion damage effect will apply to their Thorns, and then otherwise just spam Reap over and over and over and over and over, use Blight to gather enemies together with the Void legendary, and then use Blight to spend Essence, and you're good to go. Alternative aspects, you can run Bloodgetters or Viscous to get extra mages or warriors, and you can also run Might for extra damage reduction, or Reanimation, which gives you damage to your skeletons, which does scale their Thorns up as well. You also obviously want Thorns on every slot that can have it, which is going to be your pants, chest, amulet, and Mendeln, as well as a shield. So that's where you can get all your Thorns. And then damage reduction and cooldown reduction are also super useful for this build as well. In general, cooldown reduction comes from Helm, Amulet, and Offhand, with some very specific items that can have it. But in general, Helm, Amulet, and Offhand can have CDR, and you want to have that in this build. When it comes to minions, I think the only choice you really have is Defenders, mainly because they have increased life. You can also get it so they get 10% more Thorns from you, which increases their damage output. If you get to a point where they can't stay alive, you can also get Avoiding Direct Damage, which is useful for some mob sets, specifically mob sets like cannibals or goatmen that have big single target shots that can kill your minions really hard. This avoids that, which is really nice. But in general, you can get thorns from your defenders. If you find that you're running easy content like Helltide or equal level content, you can pick up Reapers, and then they'll proc more lucky hit. And you can also spawn more corpses and get more Fortify if you are running Necrotic Carapace. For mages, you have two options. If you're running equal level content or content around your level like Helltide and stuff, I would recommend just getting shadow damage from shadow mages. The reason being is that if you run cold mages, they will freeze the target. A target that's frozen doesn't attack you and doesn't get thorns, which is pretty rough. So when you're doing easy content, just run shadow mages with the shadow bolts. However, if you're running really difficult content, I found the vulnerable from the freeze to be super useful. And sometimes you really do just want little breaks of the enemy attacking so that you can recover from the damage that's coming in. So that the occasional freeze from this is nice, plus the chill does help kind of gather minions and keep enemies and keep them together, which is nice. So difficult content, run with the vulnerable cold mages, and then for easier content, you can run shadow where they can be allowed to attack more often. And then for your golem, you want to run the bone golem. This is an easy choice. Not only does he have a big fat taunt, which is really useful for gathering minions together and forcing them to attack your golem, which has your highest coefficient of thorns. He inherits more thorns than any other minion that you have. But also you can increase his max HP and increase that thorn amount from 30% to 50%, which is absolutely huge. And then you can force them to attack him, which is super nice. And lastly, let's talk about Paragon. The primary focus of this is going to be twofold: making you tankier and making your minions tankier while picking up any damage bonus that you can along the way to make sure that you deal more damage. But the primary is you need as much damage reduction as you can get, because eventually, if you can't be hit by the enemies, you can't deal thorns damage. So you want to be in the immovable objects. You want to be as tanky as you can. The primary for glyphs here, we're going to run one territorial. Close damage scales thorns and gives us damage reduction, which is super nice. We come up into Cult Leader first, and anytime you run Cult Leader, I would recommend running Dead Razor. The big thing about this is that the flat bonus of this glyph increases the minion damage and damage reduction modifiers in range, which means that when you run with damage reduction for your minions and damage for your minions, it scales those. So it takes all this damage reduction for minions and scales it up even more. So Dead Razor is a perfect fit for the Cult Leader board. And it also gives us increased damage when our minions deal damage, which they do it pretty quickly and pretty often for that as well, which is really nice. We pick up the armor, we pick up the bonus of the increased damage for each type of minion is the reason why we have mages in general, even though they don't inherit much thorns. It does give us more damage increase, which is nice, and gives us more thorns as well. We want Scent of Death for the main reason that when we're standing near two corpses, we get 15% damage reduction. Super nice. When there's no corpses, we get damage, but there's going to be corpses always, so we keep that up as well. We're also going to run with the Golem Glyph, which allows us to increase Golem damage, increases thorns, and increases the maximum HP of the Golem to keep him alive as well. And then we're going to go pop up into Hulking Monstrosity. We want this for the damage and HP for the Golem. We want to pick up any defenses that work for the Golem as well. And then we also want to pick up the Revenge Glyph. You could swap this for Control if you wanted to do damage to CC targets. It will always be slowed from Decrepify, which is nice. And especially if you're running with the Cold Mages, you get frozen from that bonus as well, which is super cool. And then you can also get some bonus damage from that. From Revenge, if you're running it for Thorns, procs more bonus damage, which also gives you more Golem damage and survivability as well. Then we go over to Flesh Eater, and we do this so that we can pick up a little bit of armor along the way. And then we come over here and we pick up Darkness. This one is insanely strong. What this says is that when you or your minions deal shadow damage, as long as you have willpower and range, you will reduce the damage that enemies deal by 10%. This is separate from damage reduction for you, which has its own cap, but you are debuffing the target, like with Decrepify, to make it do less damage for you, and to your minions. More damage reduction means that we can tank longer, which means we can deal more damage with Thorns. And then lastly, I found it pretty effective to pop over into the Bloodbath tree, because right next to this, if you rotate the board and come in here, is if you pop in, damage taken over time reduction. You can get a large amount of this. It's like almost 20% damage reduction taken over time. This helps a lot with like toxic lurkers that apply that full HP bar, poison, shadow damage, bleeding. All of those effects can scale really high in High Nightmare. Having damage reduction reduced, damage taken reduced from the dots in the game is actually kind of nice, and I found this to be a really easy last-minute pickup for the build to make it stronger. So that is the Paragon, that is the gear and stats, that is the skill tree for the build, and that is the Thorns build. So to the people that were asking, hey, can we get an endgame Ribcage update for Thorns? You absolutely can, and surprisingly, I didn't think this build was going to be able to go past, Nightmare 50. It turns out it can go much higher than I thought. So if you're a Thorns fan, now is the time to rejoice. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.